Now, this topic I personally wanted to bring up because it seems to be kind of divisive when you hear people talking about sequels in general. Um, it seems like the more vocal gamers, the ones that have YouTube channels, I usually hear a lot about, you know, they complain when a franchise keeps, like, not even yearly franchises, like Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty. They're not even talking about those. They're talking about, you know, your Marios and your Pokemon and, um, any game that doesn't have, like, any game that, like, I guess has more than two or three games. Apparently, I've even heard people complain about this with Legend of Zelda. Like, they don't like the fact that certain game franchises just seem to kick out sequel after sequel after sequel, and they want something new. They're tired of that franchise. Um, so I guess what I wanted to kind of open up with, and you can start us off with this. Sequels in general, are sequels a good idea? Are they a bad idea? How many is too many sequels? You know, how come some sequels just never seem to get made no matter how many people ask for them or how many fans ask? Um, so yeah, I just kind of wanted to start there.
All right, yeah. Um, I think that sequels are necessary, honestly. Like, if you have a game that's just brand new, it's a brand new IP, brand new concept, um, and you bring it out, and no one's ever heard of it, and it does okay, and you look at reviews for the game, and you see like a bunch of people are like saying, "Yeah, overall it was a decent game. Like I would change this, I would improve this, I would get rid of this." Like reviews, I feel like sequels to video games are like kind of think of it in like a college paper. Like first you start out, you get all your information, you get everything, and then you pretty much get all the materials you need for to begin the paper. And let's say that you come up with a draft of the paper and you give it to your professor and they look over it. That's pretty much like that's first game popped out, and then you just wait for the review, and then they give you back and they tell you everything that they thought was good, everything that they thought you could change, and everything that they told you to take out. You take that information and then you make your paper better, and you just keep doing that and doing that and doing that until you get something that's just A plus worthy. I feel like that's what has to happen for games. Like you can't just, or at least a lot of the time, you can't just have one game and have it just be an amazing success and like just keep coming out with like the same thing. Like just because something's amazing doesn't mean that you can replace something else or the exact same thing with like tweaked just little tiny things and then just like slap a new title on it and be like this is two. It's like that's not how sequels work. That's not how you progress a game. You progress a game by changing things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, sometimes sometimes they're drastic changes, sometimes they're small changes. Sometimes they look at reviews. Game developers look at reviews for their game and they see what people like, they see what people didn't like, and some people will have different views on different things. Some people will like something that someone else won't like, and they'll put a review on it, and someone else will review the exact same thing but give an opposite review. And sometimes you just have to go with what's the more popular review or just what you feel is better. Sequels are how you make games better. Does that mean that every sequel is going to be better? No, but that's you just have to keep trying. There is a point, I believe, where you have to stop. Like that's like you're at the point where it's done, you're good. Like leave it at where it's at. And then there are some games where people complain about them, and let's go ahead and talk about Call of Duty just because that's a really popular game for some reason. And There's a whole bunch of them. Like Call of Duty gets released every year. Everyone expects it.
There are sequels within sequels.
Yeah. And sometimes we'll even get two Call of Duty games in one year. Like, it's crazy. And, people look at this, myself included, we look at it, and sometimes people will play the game and they'll be like, okay, this is what I like about it, this is what I don't like it. Sometimes people will just look at it and just be like, I don't like it because it's Call of Duty. If you think about it, multiplayer FPS games, really, the only things that can be changed are if it's sci-fi or if it's realistic. And what's it based on? Like, when you think about it, all games of like every genre, they're pretty much the exact same thing with different stories, different looks to them, and different weapons, items, characters, everything. Everything is the same genre as everything else. They just have their own unique things that make them their own, and then sequels improve on that. And I feel like what a lot of people complain about is a lot of people complain that a lot of sequels are just the same thing and they're just like pumping them out just to make money. Well, if they're making money from it, doesn't that mean that it's good? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Honestly, I think Call of Duty needs to take a step back. I think that maybe they need to take a year off and I think they need to just look at everything because Battlefield has gone from kind of a little bit more advanced warfare and more advanced weaponry than what's more modern now to World War One. Like they've completely gone backwards, and there's a lot of hype about Battlefield One, although it's a confusing name
Yeah.
because it,
There is a Battlefield,
yeah, and
original Battlefield.
searching that is just confusing. So that's another thing that needs to come in mind. Names. Just I feel like a lot of people just pick things and just pick at sequels. And if it's just a sequel that they don't like, or just a game franchise that they don't like, they're gonna pick on it and they're just gonna be like, no, it doesn't need a sequel. It's fine. The first game was fine. Don't touch it. And then there's some games where like the core mechanic is the exact same, and the only difference is like aesthetic wise, like Pokemon. Every Pokemon game plays the exact same as every Pokemon game. The only difference is location and different Pokemon with every generation.
And they usually introduce something new,
Yeah, sometimes um,
like the 2-on-2 battles that started in, was it Game Boy Advance?
yeah, yeah. Double battles was huge, even though it was just a tiny little thing. It's just a tiny little difference, and it didn't even happen all the time.
No.
Like, but it was still like this huge thing of people like, oh my gosh, I can fight with two Pokemon against two other Pokemon. Like that was a big thing. And then as things progressed, like they got into like there were triple battles, and then there were turn battles, and there was a lot of battling differences or just new ways to battle. And then uh, another thing, mega evolutions, that became a thing. And at first, people were skeptical about it, and they were saying that it wasn't going to be a good thing. Now everyone loves it because mega evolutions now provide a better. They provide some Pokemon with better competitive abilities. Like in the competitive world of Pokemon, Mega Evolutions, I think you're allowed one Mega Evolution in your team, and that can that can drastically change your entire team. Like a good Pokemon player, I think in the competitive world can win without. They can definitely win without a Mega, but a Mega can tip the scales if you're losing. So that's something that's new and improved. And the game X and Y that introduced that, basically the same exact game. Another core mechanic, or another, not a core mechanic, but another thing that made that game unique is being able to change your outfit. Like, people went wild over that. Like, you were able to change your clothes and make your character unique to you, which was cool and hadn't been done before in Pokemon. Did it change anything in the gameplay? Not at all. Nothing. But people still loved it. And people are going to keep loving things like that. Like, I think Nintendo does sequels, I want to say, the most correctly. Just sometimes it's repetitive. Like Pokemon, instead of like releasing new games every year, uh, they'll release two different games at the same time, and they'll have like one will have different Pokemon than the other, and maybe the story's changed a little bit based on like your enemy or something like that. Mario games. Mario games are pretty much all just platformers. It's just a different version of platforming or different locations of platforming. They're all the same. All shooting games, they're all the same. Just different skins, better graphics, cooler looking weapons, better sound effects, and I don't know, I feel like stories in FPS games haven't become like a huge thing. I feel like FPS games are more just about multiplayer than they are about stories.
Yeah, and I mean that's going back to the the Quake days where you had a loose story to tie everything together. I kind of feel like Overwatch is like that, although Overwatch kind of has um, a huge amount of lore that can actually go to and you can look up. Halo is like that. Halo's actually got a ton of story behind it.
They have books, multiple books, actual novels,
Yeah.
and I've read a few of them. They're great. I love the story behind Halo. Halo is probably one of my favorite FPS franchises ever. And I've talked good about like sequels. I feel like that there are companies that they do need to just. I feel like they need to stop. Halo and Call of Duty. I feel like they both need to stop. And it's not because they're first person shooter games and like they're just everywhere. Like first person shooters are just everywhere. There's not a lot of other types of genre gaming that's like huge. But FPS games are just kind of like everywhere now. That's become like the new thing. Like back then, it was like platformers. Like what's the best platformer you can make, and people would compete over that. And their sequels would be better, how to better platform and make everything good. Now it's FPS games, and I feel like because I play a lot of RPG games, I look at stories a lot, and FPS games still have stories to them because they have wars, and wars have stories to them. And I feel like war stories are some of the I don't want to say cooler because I don't want to say that like war's awesome. It's terrible, but the stories behind it are what make wars interesting, and that's also how you could just
Well, stories happen within the war that are interesting.
yeah,
It's not just the overarching political and you know uh, the stage of war that is necessarily a story. There's a lot of smaller stories to tell within those events.
yeah, and even like the smallest thing could have a huge effect on a war. So just like stories in FPS games, I feel like they matter just as much as stories in maybe not as much because I think in like RPGs the story is like huge, but FPS games I feel like they still need to have some story, and the story needs to be good. Call of Duty stories, the story missions or the campaign, I feel like they just haven't been as good. Like the original Call of Duty games were like actual wars that happened, or a Modern Warfare 2. Um, I think Modern Warfare was more like realistic and it was more like modern. Modern Warfare 2 was kind of modern and then it kind of like jumped a little bit, but not too much to where it'd be drastic. I feel like those were the last two good stories for that FPS franchise. I feel like everything after that was focused more on multiplayer and what they could do for multiplayer. And same thing with Halo. I think Halo 4, a lot of people are like iffy on that story. I feel like as a sequel, it's okay. I feel like that should have been the end game. That should have been the one to end Halo. I feel like
Hmm.
because Halo 3, Halo was amazing. Halo Combat Evolved was amazing. Halo 2 was amazing. Halo 3 was amazing. All three of those are FPS games. The multiplayer was great. The stories got better, and Halo 3 left off on a cliffhanger. And like a lot of people waited for a long time to figure out what happened to Master Chief. And then Halo 4 comes out, and then instead of making like what could have been the best sequel for that game, story wise, uh, gameplay wise, and multiplayer wise, Instead, they opened up a new chapter. It was like this part of Master Chief's world has ended, and now this is open. Like what made Halo sequels good was it was all about like the actual Halos. Like Halos are giant weapons in space that can eradicate just galaxies. They can just decimate everything, and they were pretty much uh, emergency kind of kill switches for the Flood, which can infect every race. And those were designed to eradicate the Flood because the Flood is a legitimate problem in the Halo uh, story. And instead of finishing that, they jumped to Forerunners, which was it was more of like a legend in Halo. It was like the Forerunners. They were the ones who created the Halos, which I feel like maybe ending Halo with Master Chief, just have it be all about the Flood and like how to stop the Flood, because that's pretty much what the whole game series is about: is stopping the Flood and fighting off the Covenant. Um, those are your two main threats. And instead of Halo 4 being a good end sequel to end Master Chief's story, they just wanted it to keep going because they wanted to compete with Call of Duty.
Well, and when they announced Halo 4, they basically were saying this is going to be the start of a new trilogy.
Yeah, which I don't know. As a fan of the series, I didn't like that. And the way that they're taking it now, Halo 5, I honestly didn't bother getting it because other than focusing on the aliens attacking them, they were focused more on like the two different stories of like Master Chief and Locke, which, I guess that would be okay, but I feel like it's just trying to keep up. It's just trying to keep going and like live as long as it can.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like franchises that are doing that, they need to just stop. Or at the very least, try and end on a good note. Because you never want your franchise's like next entry to end on a bad note because that's all people will remember. They won't remember. Well, they will, but the thing that they'll remember is what it ended on. And I feel like sequels, that's what it's leading up to. It's leading up to this grand finale of just amazement. Like the story was great, the gameplay was great, everything about it was great. That's how you end a sequel. And I feel like a lot of people are just trying to keep things going so they don't have to, just so that they can keep more money or keep getting more money.
Yeah, with sequels, there's always this balancing act that you have to play because if you're making a sequel to a hit game, you basically already have a fan base there. They're going to Most of the people who play the first game are going to go out. They're automatically going to buy that second game. I'm one of those people. If I play the first game in something, I can't wait for the second one to come out and see what new ideas they're going to bring. The developer has a responsibility to actually bring new mechanics, and sometimes they don't always do that, and that's when you can see a franchise start to falter. Um, I do think there's definitely some franchises that we need a break from. Assassin's Creed. Very glad that Ubisoft is finally taking a break. We would get sometimes two brand new Assassin's Creeds in the same year, along with like a collection or of like previous Assassin's Creed games. And it's like, well, great, just because it's selling for now. And what they saw a big dip with Assassin's Creed Syndicate, where basically due to the buggy launch that everyone knew about from Unity, and they got all that bad press from it. Even though Syndicate launched without a hitch, it had much fewer sales to it, and that's what has caused them to go back to the drawing board. And the thing is you have this problem with sequels where you get in this rut of you start kind of releasing the same game. Assassin's Creed started to become like that. I want to say with 3 onwards, with the exception of Black Flag, which was excellent. But 3 onward, they just kind of started having the same exact thing that they were doing. I mean, they would have like, Unity, oh, well, this is the next gen one, and Syndicate, oh, well, now you have a grappling hook, and with Black Flag, you had a ship that you could sail all around the Caribbean, and it totally changed the way the game played. That's a major change, but it still had all of the Assassin's Creed elements to it. But they're just being released way too often. I like to think, and this honestly depends on what genre of game you're talking about, but honestly, Smash Brothers, I used to think, my goodness, Smash Brothers takes so long for us to get a new game. And that was definitely the case, I feel, with between Melee and Brawl. That was like a good 7 years. I want to say we only had 6 years between Brawl and Smash 4. And with that, what you do is there's enough time that goes by. I'm not saying every game franchises need to only release a new game every 6 years, because some of them can definitely do that more often. I kind of feel like the magic number is probably 3 years. And what that does is that allows you to evaluate things. It allows you to see what mechanics work in the first game. What Nintendo does that I absolutely love, and every time I read developer notes about their games, Mario, Zelda, Metroid, they take into account, they basically have a mechanic that they come up with. They may not have enough time to get it fully implemented. They'll hang on to those notes. And then when the sequel comes around, they make that like the point of, they make it a point to get that in there. I think this may have happened with Yoshi may have been meant to be in Super Mario Bros. 3, but they just ran out of time developing that game, and he wound up in Super Mario World instead. So do things like that. Like, you don't have to... The thing with... And then with DLC, that's kind of complicated matters, right? Because you can go back and add features to a game that it didn't have at launch, which to me, that should be what DLC is. And not to get too sidetracked on DLC, but the fact that DLC for most developers has become this, oh, hey, well, we'll only put this much on the game disc, and this is the initial $60 release. But we're planning all this extra stuff that you can either pay individually for or get the season pass, which is going to be the same price of the game. So we're doubling the price of the game for all the content that we're planning for it. It's like, yeah, I don't want to spend $120 for your game that in a year's time you're going to come out with a sequel. I'm specifically thinking of Star Wars Battlefront here. That's just... You can only squeeze blood so much from us. You can't get blood from a stone, is what I'm trying to say. So, yeah, I don't think yearly releases work for any type of game. You kind of have to go through this cooldown time for people to, I guess, start to miss the game. Because the weird thing is people will play a game and then they'll set aside and they'll never play it again. I'm not one of those gamers. I love going back and revisiting games that I've played before, but not everyone's like me. So when it's been 3 years, 4 years, and it's like, oh yeah, I remember playing that game a few years ago, you really jazz up the fan base at that point. And you're gonna, since you're a developer who's been, maybe developing this game for all that time, you've had a small team start with it, and then each year you add more members to the team. You can come up with some great ideas. That's what I love about how they've been doing the Legend of Zelda games. They basically are doing this, leapfrog thing with, hey, we'll have a handheld game, and then we'll have a console game, then we'll have a handheld game, then a console, and they'll go back and forth like that. And they're able to kind of keep things fresh in the meantime. So yeah, sequels aren't necessarily bad. You shouldn't get irritated. People got mad about Super Mario Galaxy 2 having so much content that was similar to the first Super Mario Galaxy. Well, that was because those were all ideas that they couldn't get into the first Galaxy. Again, they wanted to have Yoshi in the first Galaxy game, but they ran out of time. So I'm kind of baffled sometimes when people complain about things like that. I completely understand the complaints about yearly releases with Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed, but the ones that are every so often, every few years, those just confuse me.
I feel like those games, they have a long enough time to where they're able to implement plenty of new things into the game to make it more unique to itself than the last one. So, yeah, I feel like games that wait a little bit longer to release, other than release once a year, those tend to be the better sequels,
Yeah.
which are why so many of those games are still going. Like Mario has, I think, over 100 games because, well, they do release more than one game a year usually, but
But those are different genres.
yeah,
They're different franchises.
yeah,
Like Paper Mario is an RPG. Mario sports games, those are their own thing.
yeah. The reason why I think people might see that in as Mario is because oh, he's just popping out games. It's but they're all different games. Like the Mario Kart is racing. The Mario RPG series, they're RPGs.
Yeah.
Super Mario 3D Land, that's a platformer.
That's a 3D platformer.
3D platformer.
3D platformer is different from 2D platformer. Don't think of those as the same, franchise. I don't.
Yeah, which is why that happens with Mario because he has his.
He's Mr. Video Game. That's this honestly when Miyamoto came up with Mario, he wanted him to be like this completely ubiquitous character that could fit any role. And that's how Nintendo uses them.
Yeah. And then you look at their other games, like The Legend of Zelda doesn't release very often. It releases
console release once every 4 to 5 years.
Yeah. And we might get multiplayer game or
little handheld games.
Yeah, handheld
and stuff.
games a little bit more often, but that's just to
tide you over.
Yeah, I want to say quench your thirst until the main console game comes out, and then you get some little handheld console games, and then you get another console game. It's things like that.
And usually the handheld ones are throwbacks to older ones, like A Link Between Worlds, throwback to A Link to the Past. The Phantom Hourglass and Spirit tracks, those were callbacks to Wind Waker. One of them was a direct sequel to Wind Waker. So there's a correct way and there are incorrect ways to do sequels. They're not all bad. They're not all good. It's just, like I said, it's a balancing act that you have to play. And if you mess it up, people can get tired of your series real quick.